In this lesson, we are going to be talking about restorative justice. And restorative justice in America and really across the world stems from a couple of different underlying movements. The community justice movement, a growing recognition of indigenous dispute resolution, and then the victims' rights movements of the 1980s in America. So, victims and the victims' rights movement played a big role in the movement towards restorative justice. So, of course, the criminal justice system relies heavily on victims of crime. It relies on victims to report the crime, right? If there's no crime report, for the most part, law enforcement is unaware of the vast majority of crimes without reports. So the victim has to report the crime. Oftentimes, then the victim has to testify in court or provide some sort of testimony as part of the investigation. But sometimes victims of crime can feel like they were victimized a second time by the system, right? So this can happen in during the testimony, during court. So the defense, the accused, has a right to cross-examine witnesses. And so a lot of times that cross-examination can happen even before court, where the prosecutors and where the police begin that process. And then, of course, when the defense attorney in court cross examines, they can call into question the victim decisions. They can call into question the victim's accuracy, et cetera, et cetera. And so victims sometimes feel like they've been victimized by the system again. Also, oftentimes victims aren't told what's happening in a court case. They don't know what's happened to the individual who committed a crime against them, who victimized them. And then sometimes they may feel like justice wasn't served in some form or another. So, to address those issues, there was a growing victims' rights movement that said, look, the accused have all these rights, but we don't have the same sort of rights for victims. And so a lot of states started passing victims' rights legislation. Some states have such legislation actually as amendments within their state constitutions. Others just simply have statutes, and some have actual offices for victims' rights and that sort of thing. So, one of the major victim rights is just information about the case as it passes through the justice system. So, prior to this, historically, a victim would report a crime, provide testimony, and and then that might be it. They would never find out. They might not know if the individual was successfully prosecuted, what the sentence was. They would have to really go out of their way to find out how things were going. And so now a lot of victims have a right to be provided with that information. Information about the conviction, sentencing, imprisonment, and release of the offender. So now victims generally are provided with information of whether or not there was a conviction, what the sentence was, when the offender might get released, in which case sometimes they actually can be part of a parole hearing. But also, obviously, if you were the victim of a crime, you might feel safer knowing exactly when the offender was getting out, so you're not sort of constantly wondering about that, worrying about that. Participation in court proceedings related to the offense. So oftentimes this takes the form of some sort of written statement, which sometimes can be read during the sentencing process, where the victim can give an impact statement about how the crime affected them. And that usually is during the sentencing stage so that it might influence the sentencing. Also, they can get protections from the accused offenders. So they can get restraining orders. Sometimes, if an offender, once they've been convicted, maybe they're on GPS monitoring or something, and they can't go with, not only you sort of have two different methods of community uh, surveillance if you're out, and one is like you're not allowed to leave a certain area, so you have to stay within your home or 100 feet of your home. Another is you're not allowed to go to certain areas, and so I might not be able to go to a victim's residence or a victim's place of work. And again, this is also for the accused offender. So if before the trial, uh, the victim could be protected from me. Restitution. So, if you're the victim of a crime, if you get beat up, if you are assaulted in some way, you go through some sort of process where you now have to go to a hospital, you're taking time off work, right? You've got medical bills. It can be really expensive to be the victim of a crime. And so, oftentimes now offenders have to pay restitution for their crimes. And a lot of states now have sort of, it's like victim insurance. So that if you're the victim of a crime, which again can be very expensive, not just by losing stuff, but through lost work time and everything else, you can actually submit for compensation from the state to help offset some of the losses that you have incurred as a victim of crime. So here are some examples. We have a federal office for victims of crime. And here you can see they have all kinds of stuff. They have grants, they have public awareness, they sponsor a victims national victims month. So all kinds of stuff, all kinds of. So if you ever do, God forbid, find yourself as a victim of crime, you can go in here and you can see what your rights are and all that sort of thing. Or if you're just interested, you can always go in here and read up on what they do. And then there's also this organization to get a constitutional. So again, some states actually do have constitutional amendments for victims' rights. This is actually to get a federal constitutional amendment. So this is the National Victims Constitutional Amendment passage. And you can see this is the actual text. If we can click on it here. And so it'd be the following rights of a crime victim being capable of protection without denying the constitutional rights of the accused shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state. The crime victim shall have the rights to reasonable notice of and shall not be excluded from public proceedings, to be heard at any release, plea, sentencing, or other proceeding involving any rights established by this article, to proceedings free from unreasonable delay, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these are basically the rights that I just listed, trying to make that actually a constitutional amendment so it becomes a guarantee. So you can go check out that website. They have a lot of information. They have all the different states that are doing that, right? So you can see states with victim rights amendments. So they're just trying to do it at the federal level. Real quick, I would like to also sort of end the conversation on victims as be very careful about claiming to speak for victims. A lot of times people will talk about what they think is the appropriate punishment for a crime, and they will often invoke victims. Well, this helps victims. It's the only way for victims to get justice. Unless you are the victim of a crime, you should really stop and be very reluctant before you ever claim to speak for victims, or really any group for that matter. But in particular, a lot of groups will claim to speak for victims, but really they're just speaking for their own political beliefs. So if you're the victim of crime, absolutely you should have every right to be involved in how it's prosecuted, and to be involved in the process and how it ends up panning out for the offender, and what it is would make you feel safer, make you feel better, make you feel more whole. But beyond that, you really should not speak for victims as a group. So just think about that. And I'd like to end with a couple of questions. Describe one way victims could be involved in constructive offender reentry initiatives. How might offenders benefit from those kinds of initiatives? And how might the victims actually benefit from that? Okay, hopefully you put down some interesting ideas. Probably the most widespread way that victims are involved is through victim impact panels. And that is where victims of crime go and speak to offender groups about the impact that that crime has had on their lives. So one example, if you go back to some of the original victim impact panels, would be MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, where the mothers, the parents of children who were killed by drunk drivers would go to prison or other places and talk to convicted drunk drivers about the effect that it had on their lives. There are groups that will go and talk, say, former rape victims that will go into prison and talk to convicted rapists about the impact it had on their lives. You also have, in some instances, in probation and other court programs, retail establishments will actually have victim impact panels about the costs of shoplifting and theft on retail and small business and that sort of thing. But this is a victim group talking to an offender group. It is not the specific victim and offender talking to one another. So that is restorative justice. So another way the victim can be involved is where the victim actually talks to the offender who victimized them. And that's really what restorative justice is about. And of course, this quote here, crime hurts, justice should heal. That is obviously then what restorative justice is about. It's about restoring the victim and restoring the community, and also about restoring the offender. So it's not about retribution or vengeance or even really rehabilitation or any of these things. It's about healing and about restoration. And it is, as opposed to the other philosophies of punishment like retribution, deterrence, and all these other ones we've talked about, it is very focused on the victim. Everything else is focused very much on the offender, but you'll notice in the last several lessons we've talked about, victims hardly ever come up in this conversation. Well, restorative justice tries to flip that around and involve the victims and remind people that crime, there is a victim to crime, and it's not the state, it's an individual. So the objectives of restorative justice is primarily, first and foremost, repairing the harm done to the victim. So it is a reminder and it is imperative to remember that there is a victim to a crime, right? At this point, we tend to view crimes as, what is it, Indiana, right? The state of Indiana versus whoever this accused offender is. We've taken a lot of crimes out of the realm of what they truly are, which is a conflict between two people where one person has done something, has taken something from somebody else, and we turn it into this crime against the state, against the community. So, first and foremost, restorative justice focuses on the victim and also on repairing the harm done to the victim. So it's not focused on, well, what do we do to the offender? Do we rehabilitate the offender? Do we punish the offender? It's how do we make this victim whole again? There was a victim to this crime. We need to focus on that victim. Another objective is to actually get the offender to recognize how they harmed the victim. And again, our traditional criminal justice system isn't really interested in that. We have a lot of, majority of cases are pled out, a guilty plea, but pleading guilty is not at all the same as recognizing the harm you've done. And so that goes back then to the victim impact panels, where that is one of the important sort of outcomes they're shooting for, is to get the offender to really recognize what they've done to people. And oftentimes when you see interviews with offenders who've gone through these impact panels, you'll hear them say, "Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. I never really thought about how I would feel if I was the victim of that crime. I didn't really think about how I affected those victims of those crimes," right? I mean, that's part of what crime is. There's no real consideration for the effects it has on those around you. And then finally, the ultimate goal is to then sort of reconcile the victim, the offender, and the community, right? So you're trying to repair the harm done to the victim. You're trying to get the offender to recognize the harm they've done. And then at the end, you're trying to restore the community. And so you're trying to, you're right. So over 90% of offenders get out of prison. So we need to have a way of, once the offender has been punished, Once the victim has been healed, how do you then recreate that community? How do you bring people back together? And of course, our criminal justice system is terrible at that. We really just focus on getting the offender punished, and then we might have some sort of restitution order for the victim, and then that's really where it ends. There's very little of number three, the reconciliation among victim, offender, and community. And obviously, that's probably the hardest part. It assumes the victim wants that. It assumes the community, which as a community, we're not very open to that. And it also assumes the offender is ready for that. So I love this chart, and I use it in a couple of classes where I talk about restorative justice because I love restorative justice. It's this to me, it's this great thing that I think is has so much potential, but it's also something that I think personally I would struggle the most with if I was a victim. Uh, and I definitely struggle with it just in my personal life when I have conflicts with people. The actual implementation of something like restorative justice is much harder. I guess, than it might seem. But anyways, here you have this model. You have basically the retribution model, the treatment model, and the restoration model of justice. And you could really think it in terms of right wings and left wing, right? So the retribution model is basically the right wing model. The treatment model is the left wing model. And then one of the things I like about restorative justice is it sort of transcends that model and sort of steps outside this right wing, left wing dichotomy we always have over corrections, over criminal justice, over punishment. And so you can see here with retribution, accountability is to the justice system, right? It's to the criminal justice system. We hold the offender accountable to the criminal justice system. And the way we measure the outcome is, was the offender punished, right? Was the offender punished? Was the offender punished sufficiently? That's how we get justice, as we talked about with that's the retributive model. And we do this through incarceration, through punitive fines, through surveillance, and all the things, all the gear we typically associate with punishment. On the other hand, you have treatment. And this is we are accountable to the offender's needs. And that is their criminogenic needs, right? The idea is, well, what we're saying is these offenders committed crimes because of some need, right? If you go back to the medical model that we've talked about, right, there's something broken in the offender's life, whether it's employment, whether it's cognitive behavioral functioning, um, all these different problems these offenders have. If we want them to stop offending, we have to fix what's broken. And so the idea is, well, if we can treat the parts of the offender's life that's making them commit the crime, they will stop committing the crimes, which is obviously a pretty good thing. So then the outcome is, have we identified what the problem is for that offender, why it is that individual is committing crimes, and then we do that through rehabilitation, job training, all these different sort of reentry programs to try to ensure that the offender will reintegrate into the community and not commit another offense. But then you have the restorative justice model. And this is, well, no, accountability should be to the victim, right? Not to the justice system and not to the offender, but to the victim. So we measure the success of justice to the extent to which the victim has been restored, right? And so that's how we measure the outcome. Is the victim close to a place where he or she was prior to being victimized, prior to this crime? And that can happen through restitution. So if you steal from me and you cost, or even if you beat me up and it costs me money and resources to recover from that, restitution is a very simple way to help me get restored materially, at least. And then another method is victim offender mediation. This is where the victim and the offender come together through a restorative justice circle and hash out the problem. They each tell their story along with the community and others, and they try to come to they try to mediate some sort of outcome that works for everybody. And that mediation, a lot of it is really sort of based in these indigenous dispute resolution circles or practices. So there was this, during colonization, Western Europeans, when they come in to these areas, the New World, they really did not recognize that these indigenous peoples had legal systems. From the perspective of the Western Europeans, they had no laws, they had They had no legal system, but of course they did, right? It just didn't look anything like Western European. Obviously, they had disputes, they had crimes, and they had to handle it in their own way. And so, a lot increasingly, there was this recognition that a lot of these indigenous people, and this goes back even to Western Europeans. Really, if you go back far enough through into Western European history, just about every indigenous peoples have had uh, some sort of dispute resolution process where people come together and try to hash out this conflict in a way that keeps the community together. Obviously, for indigenous peoples, which are in smaller tribes and clans and whatnot, it's even more important. There is no prison, right? And so you have to figure out a way to how do we hold everybody together? How do we resolve these disputes? And how do we restore any victims? And so you have these reintegration ceremonies, which you should have seen some videos on Skypack. And so this is what one looks like. And as you can see, that forlorn-looking young man is probably the offender. And then you have a victim. Everybody has a loved one or a representative. So the offender would be there maybe with his or her mom. The victim would be there with his or her mom or dad, a parent. Oftentimes, you'll have somebody from the court, or you'll have a law enforcement officer. A lot of times, you'll have somebody from a church, because there's a pretty heavy spiritual component to a lot of restorative justice. In fact, a lot of restorative justice in America actually has been pushed by the Mennonites. That's why Indiana actually has a pretty rich history of restorative justice because of the Mennonite populations in Indiana. And then you have a mediator whose job it is to sort of mediate the entire process. And what happens is usually the victim speaks first, the mediator invites the victim to speak, and they tell their side of the story and where they're coming from, and then the mediator invites the offender to speak, and then maybe the representative of the community will speak, and then loved ones and supporters for the victims and offenders will speak, and then it goes from there. And then usually what they try to do is towards the end, you try to come up with a resolution that satisfies everybody. But one of the key components to restorative justice is that you're giving non authoritative actors the power to control the process. That is not the case in traditional criminal justice, right? Where you have court, where you cannot even speak if you're the victim or the offender. Your attorney speaks for you. The judge decides when people get to speak. The judge or the jury decides what the punishment is going to be, right? The actual parties to the crime, the victims and the offenders' families and the victims' families, they have very little control over that process. And so restorative justice, specifically these reintegration ceremonies, that's the basis, is to give them the authority to talk it out, for them to resolve it and come up with a resolution that fulfills the needs of everybody. A lot of this process too then is about trying to find a way to bring the offender back into the community. And so one way is to really sort of focus on the crime uh, rather than necessarily than the perpetrator, right? And so the event, not the perpetrator, is removed from the realm of its everyday characteristic. So there's a lot of denunciation of the crime as opposed to the individual who committed that crime. So you have to denunciate and say, that's wrong. What you did was wrong. We don't do that in this community. We don't accept that in this community, and we'll put up with it in this community. But the focus is on that thing, that crime, that event, more so than the individual who committed that crime. And so part of that process then is really uncoupling the event from the individual. So you have somebody who burgled. Well, for restorative justice and for reintegration, it's important to separate out a burglary from a burglar, right? And so just because you committed a burglary, that doesn't mean who you are then. That's not your entire defining moment, and now you're a burglar, right? So from the reintegration perspective, it's you're an individual who also committed burglary, right? Who did a bad thing, which again is condemned and denunciated as wrong, or excuse me, denounced as wrong, and But the individual is not necessarily denounced like that. And then there's also this focus, and this is why the community is involved, is this idea that, and this is why the perpetrator, the offender, gets to speak. They get to share the context of their lives and how they came to commit this offense. And there's a recognition that a lot of us share responsibility for crime in the community, right? And this coordinator job, then, this individual that has to sort of, the mediator who pulls it all together, they have to identify with everybody. They have to identify with the victims, with the families, but also with the perpetrators, and of course, with the community and the public interest in upholding the law. And you can, I believe you can go to Bloomington. They have VORP, Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. You can go down there and you can train and you can be a volunteer VORP mediator, which, uh, if you have the time and if you live on the South Side, I would recommend doing something like that. That is a great resume item because if you can mediate in a victim offender reconciliation meeting, my goodness, you can do a lot of things and lots of jobs inside and outside of the criminal justice system really involve dispute resolution. And so that's a great experience that I would really recommend. At the end, you have to have some sort of rights of inclusion. Right, so what we do in the traditional criminal justice system is we end with the separation of the denounced person. That's it. They're found guilty, they are sentenced, they go away to prison, they go on to probation or parole. There is no including them back into the community. We only do the denunciation part. And so for restorative justice, there's usually some sort of right of inclusion, and usually that often involves like punch and cookies, having some sort of food, right? Food's really important. It's always historically for people been an important ceremonial way of coming together. And so usually there's something like that at the end where there's chatting, there's some sort of right of inclusion for restorative justice. Or in the case of more court mediated programs, oftentimes for like drug courts, which have a very restorative component to them, there will be a graduation ceremony where the offenders will graduate. There's a celebration. They're celebrated for this new identity. And it's again, instead of just the court just saying you're guilty, off you go, there's now this extra part where, well, you've done your sentence, you've fulfilled your responsibilities we've asked you to fulfill. Welcome back to the community. And so that's an important component of restorative justice and reintegration. And finally, we're going to talk about reintegrative shaming by way of labeling theory and judicious non intervention. But first, write down 3 words associated with burglar. All right, I don't know what you wrote, but the things that you wrote apply to labeling theory. And according to labeling theory, we have multiple statuses, right? Multiple identities, just like we talked about, where in reintegrative circles, people can have a plurality of selves that's not defined by any one single event. So we have various identities, right? So you could probably feel this when you're on campus. You're probably a different person than when you're at home with your nuclear family. And that's probably different than when you're around extended family, right? You kind of take on these different sort of identities. Well, the master status is your sort of your identity, your status that takes precedence over all others. So maybe it's college student, maybe it's student athlete, maybe it's parent, right? Or maybe it's your job is your master status. So that's your dominant status, your identity of who you are. Well, along with that status, there are accompanying auxiliary characteristics. And these are characteristics that are assumed to be associated with a status. So, for instance, burglar could be a master status for some people. And when you hear basically the master status of burglar, you think about what could be considered connotations. So the denotation, the definition of burglar is somebody who, breaks into private residences, private properties, and steals goods. The auxiliary characteristics are the connotations. So when you hear burglar, what do you think? Right? What are the words that come to mind? Criminal, thief, dishonest, stealthy, etc. So those are the auxiliary characteristics that we just sort of assume. So if you hear professor, you might think of certain things. Mother, you think of other auxiliary characteristics. Those are sort of the secondary characteristics. Well, those are important in labeling theory because those can help sort of define how people respond to someone and then how somebody responds to themselves and how those auxiliary characteristics ultimately can sort of change your self identification as well as your social ID. So, labeling theory is really interested in secondary deviance, not primary deviance. And so, according to labeling theorists, everybody does stupid stuff, especially when you're young. Everybody breaks the laws here and there, right? People speed, people break all kinds of rules. And again, especially young people are a lot more likely to break a lot more rules. But only some people go on to continue breaking those rules. And that's secondary deviance. And so labeling theory is not concerned with why people do bad things or people break the rules, because for labeling theorists, everybody does it initially, right? That's just part of growing up. What they're curious about is, well, why is it that small percentage of people continue on with what they call secondary deviance, right? How is it some people then go on to become what we would consider criminals? And so for them, it's the labeling process. And so they argue that official criminal labels can alter a person's self-image and encourage conformity to the stereotype associated with the label. And the stereotype is those auxiliary characteristics, right? So your self-image, your identity is your master status. And so a criminal label can change your master status. And then when that master status is changed, then you start to conform with the auxiliary characteristics, with the behaviors and expectations associated with that new master status. And so they're very concerned about the actual stigmatization and penalties that occur as a result of the process of accepting and conforming to a new criminal role as your new master status. And so for them, the real key to secondary deviance into labeling is actually getting caught. And that's what separates people who go on from people who don't. So the people who break the rules here and there, it never really overcomes there. So if I'm in high school, I'm an honor student, I run cross country, and I also like to get hammered on the weekends. I still maintain a master status of honor student who runs cross country. I just happen to get hammered on the weekends. For labeling theorists, though, if I was to be arrested and get caught one Saturday night getting hammered, and I'm arrested for minor in possession, that can become my new master status. And so people no longer view me as honor student who runs cross country, but as a guy who has to go to AA as part of probation because I've been convicted of a minor in possession of alcohol. I've had to go through the juvenile drug court, and now I have to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm on probation, right? And then people respond to me according to that. And then I start to respond to myself. I start to view myself as different because our identity doesn't really exist in a vacuum. Our identity doesn't exist outside of other people, right? Our identity very much exists in how people respond to us. Going back to that idea of you're a very different person with your family than you are, say, on campus, than you are in other places, right? Our identity is really contingent on basically on the audience for whom we're performing that identity. So for labeling theorists and really criminality, like true patterns of criminality, becoming a criminal, that is, you take on the criminal master status, is the result of the stigmatizing process, which again, for them, the crucial component of that is getting caught, being officially processed, and then being stigmatized. That changes how people respond to you. That changes how you see yourself, and then that can change your master status, and that changes everything about then how you behave. But it doesn't just happen. So if I'm an honor student in cross country and I'm bonging beers on Saturday nights and I get caught, and I don't necessarily have to then become sort of this bad kid just because that happened. My master status as honors cross country runner doesn't necessarily just give way to uh, alcohol abuser just because I got caught. So, in order to actually have that master status change and to go into further criminality, it's contingent on a number of things. One is the public nature of the label. So, if I get busted by the cops and say they let me go, so I've been caught, of more or less formally by the formal criminal justice system, but they let me go. They tell me to pour my beer out, and I drive home. Then I'm not going to change my master status. I still get to view myself as an honors cross country runner who also then happened to get caught drinking beer, right? Or if I get caught and I go through the juvenile court process, nobody actually has to find out about it. And this is why you'll notice juvenile court systems are very private. So you can go to the city county building downtown and sit in on lots of adult trials. You cannot do that for a juvenile court case. If you go to 25th and Keystone, where the juvenile courts are, you cannot get into that courtroom. They are very much private court hearings specifically for this purpose. There's an implicit recognition that the public nature of being tried for crimes can have a negative effect on a juvenile's identity. But then also there has to be an exclusionary reaction by others. So if I get caught buying beer, I'm convicted, it's public, people know about it. Some people could say, well, whatever, you're a good kid, kids drink beer, it's no big deal. You're still, in my book, you're a great cross country runner and you're a solid honor student, right? And so if that happens, then there's no problem. It's where the exclusion happens and people go, oh, did you hear? So and so got arrested for alcohol and now they're in probation and they have to go to AA. I don't want you hanging out with him. And then maybe I lose my job. And then maybe I'm kicked off the chess club because the chess club's rules and extracurricular activities for my school say you can't, be arrested for alcohol. So suddenly I'm being excluded by all of conventional society, right? And so where do I go? I have to go and find other audiences to hang out with, and that starts to alter my sense of self. So I might say, well, whatever. So people are not hanging out with me. People are calling me an alcoholic. I don't care. I know I'm a good cross country runner and an honor student. That's who I am. I know who I am, right? But if I don't necessarily have that other master status, I might be more prone to start to view myself like they view me. It's like, oh, well, I guess as I start to see myself as this rebel, this bad kid who likes to drink beer and stuff, and yeah, screw the system, and it starts to change my identity. And while I'm being excluded by conventional others, I might find support from other deviants. So maybe I go to treatment and I'm with all these other people who've been put into AA, and they become my new peer group because I've been kicked out of my extracurricular activities. I've lost my weekend job. Uh, my girlfriend's not allowed to hang out with me anymore. Basically, all the conventional peers that I had have been excluding me. I have to have a peer group. I'm around now these other kids who are also in AA, so we've got that in common. So they start to become my support system. And so the more support I hang out with them, then, hey, they know of a party, I'll go hang out with them. The more I hang out with them, the less I hang out with the conventional others. The less I hang out with the conventional others, the more I hang out with deviants, the more I start to see myself as a deviant and identify with deviant subcultures. So in order to actually have it turn into a deviant label to go into secondary deviance, all these things have to happen, right? So at any point this breaks down. So it's not like just because I go out, I bong beer, and I get arrested, that's it. I'm doomed to become a rapist at some point in my life, or a burglar or something, or a criminal, a hardened criminal or alcoholic. For secondary deviance to continue on, you really need all four of these things. It has to be public. I have to be excluded by conventional others. I have to actually feel an alteration of my personal identity. And then I have to find a supportive group of deviant others. And it's reciprocal, right? It's like I was talking about. As I'm excluded by others, I start hanging out more with other deviants. The more I hang out with other deviants, the more I'm excluded by others. The more I start to see myself as part of that deviant peer group. The more I start to see myself as part of that deviant peer group, the more I hang out with deviant others. So it's this reciprocal process where it all sort of, it's like a feedback system, right? So exclusive reactions lead to alteration in identity and a closer association with other deviants. That leads to additional exclusion, which leads to additional alteration identity, which hangs out with more deviants. And that's where it sort of spirals in this feedback loop. So what's really interesting about this theory is probably the biggest policy implication from labeling theory is to do nothing, or what's called judicious non-intervention, which is if, in fact, arresting a kid for drinking beer and forcing them through probation and AA actually can cause more harm than good by altering their identity, by excluding them from conventional opportunities, et cetera, which can lead them down a path that's very negative for them. And so that's why you have then diversionary courts. And the argument is that less is more in this case. And so with diversion, that's a process where problems otherwise dealt with in a context of delinquency and official action are instead defined and handled by other means. So the most basic judicious non-intervention is the police catch you bonging beers, and they just make you pour out the beers. They give you a stern lecture, and they send you on your way, right? That's informally handling the situation. Or I go to court, and instead of convicting me and putting me into probation and forcing me through AA, they just give me a simple talking to. Maybe they give me some community service. They suspend the sentence, and it's handled by other means. Or maybe I'm diverted entirely out of the courts. And instead, I have to go to a victim offender reconciliation program. And once I fulfill the responsibilities and obligations of that program, I'm released. So basically, you're trying to divert people out of the criminal justice system out of the concern that official actions lead to this secondary deviance by changing people's master status and their identity. So again, non-intervention means that society or the local community treats a great deal of deviance among the young as normal behavior. Remember, that's what labeling theory believes. They say, look, kids break the rules. Kids, that's part of growing up. That's a normal thing. And you just treat it as that. You tell them it's wrong, but it doesn't mean you have to put them into the criminal justice system based on that. And then that's what, for labeling theorists, help prevent secondary deviance. There was this interesting study in Florida where they sort of had a natural experiment where Florida judges actually had the option of withholding adjudication of guilt for convicted felons who are being sentenced to probation. So I could adjudicate you guilty, that is, you're found guilty, or I simply withhold adjudication and say, well, I'm going to put you on probation, and if you fail on probation, then we're going to adjudicate you guilty. But if you succeed, we're not going to adjudicate you guilty. Or I would find you guilty and then sentence you to probation, right? So those are my two options. I sentence you to probation, I find you guilty, I sentence you to probation, or I don't find you guilty, but I still sentence you to probation. So they had this sort of natural experiment where these offenders are basically the same in terms of factual guilt. But the judge was making a decision as to whether or not to adjudicate them guilty. And that is the official label of you are a felon or you're not a felon. There's a big difference there, right? So they're all going to probation. They're all found guilty. They're all getting the same sentence. So they're roughly equivalent individuals. The difference is one's going to probation as a felon and the other is not. And of course, for offenders who have adjudication withheld, no civil rights are lost because you're not a felon. You can say, right, on the check the box, you can legitimately say on employment applications that you've never been convicted of a felony. So again, you're the exact same as this person next to you. The person next to you, though, before going on probation, was found guilty and cannot say that they've never been convicted of a felony. So you're in the exact same situation. You're going through the same process, except you can say, I've never been convicted of a felony. The guy next to you doesn't get to say that. They do have to say they've been convicted of a felony. Then, of course, there's various civil rights and collateral consequences to being a convicted felon. And what they found was that the felons that were actually adjudicated guilty had a substantially greater likelihood of recidivism than those whose adjudication was withheld. So again, they're the same people. They've committed the same crimes. They're getting the same sentence. In one case, the judge adjudicates you as guilty. You're now a convicted felon going into probation. In the other, they go, well, we're going to wait and we'll see how you do on probation before we convict you. That's the only difference. That conviction, that felony conviction, significantly and substantially increase the likelihood of recidivism. What's interesting too is they found that the adjudicated guilty had a stronger effect for whites than for blacks and Hispanics, and for females as opposed to males. So basically the labeling, had greater implications for whites. And according to the study, they said, well, this supports the notion of harm minimization. If adjudicating somebody as a felon makes them more likely to recidivate, why would you want to do that? If you're trying to reduce crime, right, you're trying to minimize harm, you would want to withhold adjudication. You'd want to do whatever decreases the chances of more crimes for everyone's sake, right? Not just for the felon's sake, not for the offender's sake, but for the community, right? Nobody wants more crime. The offender doesn't benefit from it, and the community doesn't benefit from it.